Christians sometimes like to claim that archaeology proves the Bible. The problem with such claims is that once you introduce archaeology as evidence that the Bible is true, then you can't retract archaeology once the evidence begins to disprove the Bible. And that's exactly what's happening in recent years. As archaeologists continue to find more and more evidence, the facts are increasingly stacking up against the Bible as an historical document. There are many cases where archaeology completely fails to support a biblical account of history. An example would be the Exodus. There's no archaeological record at all of a mass migration of people anywhere in the deserts surrounding Palestine. The typical Christian response to this is the old tired absence of evidence is not evidence of absence argument. The problem with this argument is that it's a logical impossibility to disprove the existence of undiscovered evidence. Maybe someday an archaeologist will discover proof to back up the Exodus, but until that time, the absence of evidence is a pretty good indicator that biblical claims have not been substantiated. The absence of evidence doesn't by any means constitute proof of a biblical account. It simply means that there is no evidence that an Exodus actually occurred. Claims that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence by biblical apologists indicates a basic ignorance of the rules of evidence. Since it is an impossibility to disprove the existence of as yet undiscovered evidence, it's generally accepted that the burden of proof lies with the person making a positive assertion for the existence of such evidence. To illustrate this point, suppose you're a government agent trying to disprove claims that there is a vast government conspiracy to cover up the presence of UFOs. How would you provide evidence that they haven't landed? There is no evidence you could produce, since if they haven't landed, there is no evidence. This is the problem with using the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence argument. So, if you're using archaeology to prove the Bible, you can't claim that archaeology supports the Bible when there's no evidence. That should be simple enough to understand. So what does the archaeological record show? According to Professor Herzog of the Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Studies Department at Tel Aviv University, this is what archaeologists have learned from their excavations in the land of Israel. The Israelites were never in Egypt, did not conquer the land in a military campaign, and did not pass it on to the 12 tribes of Israel. In short, there is no archaeological evidence whatsoever to back up the claim that the Exodus even occurred. I've mentioned Exodus because it's one of the foundational myths of the Old Testament. But as more studies continue, it becomes more and more evident that biblical views of history are impossible. Since this is such a huge topic to cover, this video does not permit discussing each and every instance where archaeology fails to support the Bible. But here are the few of the more egregious errors, along with their accompanying citations. First, both Abraham and Isaac encountered the ruler of the city of Gerar. This person's name was Abimelech. Genesis 21:32 through 26:1 gives an account of this person and refers to him as the king of the Philistines. There's never been any evidence of such a king ruling over Gerar, and that comes from Van Cedars, 1975. The patriarchal account of the Bible universally tended to refer to the events that only make sense in an Iron Age or later. There are no stories of the patriarchs that can be placed into a Bronze Age time frame. Yet most of the biblical accounts refer to events that could have only happened in the Bronze Age, if they happened at all. Therefore, if the biblical accounts are viewed as history, the best that can be said about this history is that it's anachronistic. One of the problems of this Bronze Age versus Iron Age placement is that if biblical history is true in the Iron Age, then there wouldn't have been enough time for an Egyptian captivity followed by an exodus, then a wandering for 40 years in the desert, and then a conquest of Canaan. This is especially true if you interpret the timeline literally, using the Bible's account. When the Bible mentions other actual historical figures by name, like Cyrus, Darius, and others, there's no mention of the name of the Pharaoh of the Exodus. This is a glaring omission if your purpose is to give an accurate historical account of such an important event. On the other hand, if you're simply writing a myth, then you wouldn't want to include the name of the Pharaoh, because then your story could be pinned down to time and place. In other words, it never pays a prophet to be too specific. If someone is arguing with you that there is some other reason that the author of the Pentateuch decided to leave out the name of the Pharaoh of the Exodus, ask them to propose a theory that's better and more satisfying than the theory that the whole story is a myth. Many biblical scholars have declared Ramses II to be the Pharaoh of the biblical Exodus. But this can't be correct for a simple reason. We have the mummy of Ramses II, and he died a natural death in his 80s. According to the biblical account, the Pharaoh of the Exodus was drowned when the Red Sea collapsed on him and his army. Using any other Pharaoh as the Pharaoh of the Exodus creates so many problems with the timeline as to make it impossible to conclude that it was anyone else but Ramses II. But using him means that the Bible is in error on the method of his death. Were the Israelites ever in Egypt in the first place? Aside from the Bible, there is no text currently known that states that the Israelites were ever in Egypt at all. Christian apologetics usually explain this away by saying that subsequent Egyptian pharaohs were so embarrassed by the whole Exodus that they expunged all records of the Israelites after the fact. While this expunging is not outside the realm of possibility, it's also so improbable as to be almost laughable. Imagine, for example, the United States being so embarrassed by slavery in the Civil War that they tried to expunge all records of it, and you'll get an idea of the stellar effort that would be required to carry out such a deception. According to biblical mythology, the Hebrew slaves were in Egypt in charge of building and construction. Other tribes and races have also left their marks on the buildings of Egypt in the form of graffiti, yet no archaeologist has ever discovered a single inscription attributed to an Israelite. There's also no mention of the Israelites in Egypt or in any correspondence Egypt had with other nations at the time, or in any correspondence that the nations sent to Europe at the time. The only time period that could possibly fit with all the events mentioned in the Exodus would be the New Kingdom period of Egypt. According to the biblical account of the Exodus, Egypt had been decimated by a series of 10 plagues brought down upon the pharaohs by Moses. If the devastation of these plagues was as great as the biblical account indicates, then surely Egypt would have suffered greatly. Yet there's no evidence at all to support such a severe downturn in Egypt's standard of living at any time during the New Kingdom period. According to the biblical account in Exodus 12:37, after leaving Egypt there were about 600,000 adult male Israelites, along with their wives, children, and livestock, left to wander around in the Sinai desert for the next 40 years. If we assume that the biblical account is accurate, there could have been between 1 million and 2 million people, along with enough livestock to sustain them, wandering in a very small area of the desert for over 40 years. So we're talking about a group of people roughly the size of the entire population of Chicago, yet they left no trace whatsoever of their presence. Those who try to excuse this lack of evidence by claiming it was a long time ago, and that the evidence is probably decayed by now, need to understand that archaeologists have found evidence of far older events. This evidence is held up for much longer time periods in far worse environmental conditions. Some examples of this older evidence would be in the cave paintings of Lascaux, or the nearly 10,000-year-old monuments of Göbekli Tepe. Note also that any archaeologist interested in biblical archaeology is going to be extremely interested in finding evidence of the Exodus. This is the holy grail of archaeological discoveries in the field of biblical archaeology. Anyone who discovered such evidence would have his or her fame and fortune assured. Because of this, hundreds, if not thousands, of archaeologists have scoured the Sinai desert looking for such evidence. Yet in all this time, not one of them has turned up a single shred of credible evidence of the tribes of Israel wandering in the desert. A number of significant events during the Exodus occurred at a place called Kadesh Barnea. Moses' sister died and was buried there, according to Numbers 21. It was at Kadesh Barnea that Moses disobeyed God by striking a rock with his staff and was punished by not being allowed to enter the Promised Land. The account there is Numbers 20, verses 11 through 13. Kadesh Barnea was also the base of operations that Moses and later Joshua used to scout and run reconnaissance on the land of Canaan. And the account there is Numbers 13:26, Deuteronomy 1:19, and Joshua 14:7. In fact, according to the biblical account, the Israelites spent 38 of their 40 years of wandering the area in and around Kadesh Barnea. The problem here is that there is no evidence whatsoever of the occupation of the site at any time remotely fitting the timeline for the Exodus. It's safe to assume that a population of millions living in the vicinity for 38 years would leave some sort of a sign of their occupation. Yet not a single shard or piece of charcoal from a campfire dating to the Bronze Age has ever been found there. As of the date of this video, not a single event from the biblical account of the Exodus has been supported by archaeology. There are plenty of other artifacts from other time periods covering the landscape, but none at all from the time period accounted for in the tale of the Exodus. If the Bible is supposed to be taken as literal history and not myth, why did God conveniently forget to leave any extra biblical evidence of these historical events for archaeologists to find? It's not a matter of failure of archaeologists to find this evidence, since they found evidence from earlier and later periods. If someone wants to claim that absence of evidence is not evidence to the absence, then by all means do so. But if your claim is that archaeology supports the Bible, and you can't produce a single finding from archaeology that does support the Bible, then you don't really have a leg to stand on. There's also the embarrassing fact that the town now called Nazareth contains no artifacts to suggest habitation in the area until at least midway through the 2nd century. But wait, wasn't Jesus raised there? You think that we would have found some of the wares lying around. Not only that, but caves in the area had previously been used as a necropolis, or city of the dead. Jewish law then and now prohibits people to live adjacent to a necropolis. There may be, at some future time, evidence from archaeology that supports the Bible. But right now, we don't have any. So since we don't have any evidence, the simplest explanation for this lack of evidence is that the events described in the Bible didn't happen. This will continue to be true until some evidence turns up. Until that time, archaeology does not support the Bible.